Wherever you are.
All right, here we go. So we are now being recorded, and we will probably have some attendees jumping on to join us here momentarily. And Frank, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, and we'll adjourn this meeting. It's a follow-up.
You mean start meeting?
Discussion on the short-term rental licensing, and I think we probably just ought to take care of business and approve the agenda. We don't have any meeting minutes to approve. So
I'll make that motion.
all right. Second, Rex. All right, all in favor of the agenda? Aye.
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 All right.
Can I be heard, Frank?
Yes.
Good. Thank you.
And the main event here is we need to get the staff report and their recommendations, an update from Ton on their findings and recommendations. We did get a request from the Short-Term Rental Alliance, I believe they're called, to make a special presentation. And we had told them, between Leslie and I, we discussed it, said, well, we could allow that, but we're going to limit it to 5 minutes because we haven't even heard the staff report or recommendations. Now, we could ask them to wait, but I think we indicated to them, correct me if I'm wrong, Leslie, that they could go first. So I think in fairness, we might want to go ahead and let them do that. And then if they or any individuals want to make comments after the staff presentation and board discussion, we'll entertain that. Depending on how many there are, we may limit the time. We just need to do our business first and not get bogged down by a lot of comment until we've had time to hear and discuss the staff report. Anybody have any objections to that?
No, I'm in favor of that.
If that's all right, Leslie, do you know if we have a representative from that group that wants to make a presentation?
Yeah, I think, yep, and he just raised his hand too. So William Brown is the person who will be making that presentation. So let me unmute his microphone. And
all right, I may just say this group was formed, I think, primarily for the purpose of supporting the vote for the pillow tax thing for housing and childcare, but obviously it is a special interest group that's short-term rental owners and managers. So we should keep that in mind.
Okay.
William, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. Thank you, Frank. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I am a representative of EVSTRA, since everything in Estes seems to have an acronym. That's the Estes Valley Short-Term Rental Alliance. It was formed in August, and we represent hundreds of short-term rental property owners, property managers, housekeepers, maintenance personnel, people in the trades, realtors, taxpayers, and other short-term rental stakeholders. I happen to not be a short-term rental owner or involved in any way, shape, or form in the actual business, but most of the people involved are. So we are here today simply to let you know that we're strongly advocating for the adoption of ballot measure 6E, otherwise known as the lodging tax extension, which would provide major funding for workforce housing and childcare for the workers of the Estes Valley. Our interest in this initiative is both because short-term rentals rely on a strong and vibrant local workforce, and because we understand that short-term rentals would be a major part of the revenue stream caused by the enactment of this ballot initiative. We've been out there distributing yard signs and postcards and speaking at community events supporting this. I personally I've spoken at many community forums, including Rotaries, League of Women Voters. I'm going to speak soon to the Crossroads Ministry to educate voters about this ballot initiative that, if passed, will make a significant difference in expanding the options for workforce housing and childcare. So we're only really going to take about 3 minutes here because this is pretty much all I have to say, but this organization is in here to make a difference positively for the community. It's not just protecting its interests, it's trying to be part of the solution to the problems our community has to deal with. And we would like some time to respond to the recommendations that you'll make to the county commissioners or the option staff is proposing if you don't get to that point. And thank you very much for your time. And I appreciate, we really appreciate the service you're doing. We know how much time it takes and what the commitment is. So thank you for the time to be able to express this. Thank you.
Frank, you're muted, but thank you, William. I'll go ahead and mute your microphone again.
Yeah. Thank you, William. And shall we move on to the staff presentation? All right, we'll get right to it. Ton, you're on.
Ton's going to pull up the
Excellent.
slides and give you an update. Basically, I just want to clarify, we don't have draft regulations or recommendations yet. We're working toward that. So really the purpose for today is more to present to you what went to the Planning Commission and commissioners and kind of where we are in the process and what we're learning and what we're starting to develop. So Tom will tell you a lot more about that.
Okay, well, good evening all. Thank you for having us. So we're kind of picking back up on our conversation from our previous work session. So really this is just to give you an overview of the STR regulations project update. So the intent today is just to share some feedback we collected through the community questionnaire and primarily focusing on the Estes Valley, and then share feedback and summary from the Planning Commission and Board of County Commissioners work session that took place on both September 14th and September 19th. And that work session was split because there was some scheduling conflict. And so we ended up having two different work sessions. And then just to gather some feedback or thoughts from the advisory committee about the process moving forward. So just a quick overview of the community feedback today, and many of you are familiar with this. Of course, our open houses took place in early August, and then the community questionnaire wrapped up on August 28th. So that ran for a little over a month. We had a really good turnout of responses. So there were two, as you may recall, questionnaires. So there was a general questionnaire that had about 5 questions. We had 588 responses to that questionnaire. And then the second questionnaire was more detailed, got more into specific questions and options that we were looking at, trying to get the feel of the community. And that got 275 responses. And then since that time, like I said, we had our Planning Commission and Board of County Commissioners work session in September. And then of recent, just last week, we had a meeting with the local fire districts, so county fire districts, to gather feedback related to health and safety concerns, specifically about access, wildfire, and emergency evacuation. And those conversations really were led and prompted by a lot of the feedback we have received, so both from the community, then of course from our advisory committees, as well as the county commissioners. So the process and schedule moving forward, as right now in the month of October is more or less engagement. So the feedback that we did receive from the open houses and the questionnaire have been summarized and are available online. And as you see here, one of our goals was to meet with the fire districts and then also to review the Larimer County jurisdiction regulations, so other communities within Larimer County, as well as other community examples, so across the state of Colorado and elsewhere. And then starting to refine our maps. And as you recall, maybe from previous conversations where we were looking at more specifically locations and density maps. So we are still in the process of that, and I'll touch upon that here in just a bit. And that is a work in progress still. And then our events and timelines moving forward. So again, as a reminder, our initial draft regulations for public review will be available on October 25th. So that will be that first draft of revision options. And we will post those on the project website so that they are available for the community. And then, we'll send out, make an effort to get those out there and get comments. And then we are preparing to do a webinar meeting for Estes Valley on November 1st, and then a second webinar meeting for the county-wide, which would be on November 7th. And then we intend to have public input on those draft regulations through the end of November. And then again, we'll touch upon those that feedback and what have you with other advisory committees in November as well. So then the intent there moving forward would then be public hearing draft regulations in late 2022, and then the Planning Commission and Board of County Commissioner work sessions in December, with the intent that we would have hearings and then adoption of the proposed regulations come early of 2023. And then at the bottom of this slide, I did provide the project website or webpage, just as a reminder. So this is where we are posting, like I said, all of our meeting summaries, the questionnaire summary, all the helpful documentation, and then the maps that we are working on and are starting to develop. Those will eventually become available on this project website. And then also the Larimer County jurisdiction regulations, and then the other community examples that we were looking at and Leslie mentioned earlier, those are currently available on the project website. And we can, once I get through this presentation, if you'd like me to show you where those are exactly, I can do that. So then real quick, just going over our community questionnaire, I'll just touch upon this briefly, won't go into too many details, but essentially from all the community feedback that we have collected during the open houses and the questionnaire, we are essentially getting feedback that the community supports some level of regulation. So as you all know, just as a reminder, these are the topics that we touched upon within the community questionnaire. And I think we have touched upon these actually in our previous conversations. So I won't spend too much time here. And then going into the next slide, this is really a brief overview or summary abbreviation of the conversations or the feedback that we were receiving. So based on the feedback we heard, we did refine some of the questions that we put out there. We eliminated some of the ideas that did not gain much support. And then from there, here on the screen are more or less the remaining options and the topics that are still being discussed. And we have followed up and had these discussions with the Board of County Commissioners and the Planning Commission. So again, looking at things like zoning districts, again, density and intensity concerns, which we are looking to get a better understanding of that through our development of our maps and our analysis. And then, modification of the approval process based on STR type. And I know we did touch upon that in our previous conversations. And then there are other things that, like property ownership limitations, although noted here as item 6, these are things that in the past few weeks we are learning based upon other communities that this is one of those options that just may not be possible for legal reasons. So through conversations, some of these will be developed or eliminated, what have you, as we move forward. And then from that feedback from the questionnaire, like I said, we presented it to the Planning Commission and Board of County Commissioners at a work session and did get their feedback. It was, taking us in a direction is how we should move forward. So it provides that bit more information. So, getting data on residential and non-residential zoning districts to help support this work. General conversation is that we keep caps in the Estes Valley residential areas. And then the consideration of applying a cap to the bed and breakfast use or host occupied STRs. So that's a conversation that we are hearing. And then consideration of geographic percentage limits for some subdivisions within the county that have smaller lots. And then generally continue only one short-term rental per property except in the Estes Valley accommodation zone districts where existing multifamily units already exist. And of course, the Board of County Commissioners did caution and or cautious us to consider safety issues in multifamily units, and of course proceeding cautiously there. And then considering the interplay between process and our standards. So again, going back to possibly looking at approval processes being specific to the STR type. And then there was, including in that conversation, was not removing or eliminating the neighborhood notice requirement that we currently have, or not wanting or avoiding giving false hope to the community when they're in the process seeking approval. And then we did hear divergent discussion about the license transfer upon sale of an approved STR. So again, ongoing conversation. And then improving transparency and creating maps that show approved short-term rentals and making them available to the community. So looking at maybe online resources. And then evaluation and documentation process for code compliance complaints. So again, looking at maybe online resources that can be utilized by neighbors or the community when they have concerns. And then addressing compatibility concerns by creating more objective review criteria. And that's specific to the health and safety of the community, including emergency access, water availability, and wildfire hazard areas. And that goes back to then our conversations with the fire districts that we did have last week. So this is just narrowing down essentially the questions and the conversations that we've had earlier on. So going into this next slide, again, as I said, we had our conversation, a great conversation with the fire districts just last week on the 6th. And again, this was to really discuss suggested improvements to the regulation specific to public health and safety, and more specifically, looking at emergency access, wildfire evacuation. So some of the items we discussed are listed here, and it was more or less fire district standards currently. So just getting an idea of what standards may exist. So for instance, emergency access, we do know that there are standards for minimum road widths, maximum grade, and overhead height clearance. And so we had just additional conversations to see maybe what those specifics were, as well as water supply standards, access bridge weight ratings and width, as well as wildfire mitigation and emergency communication standards. And so there'd been a lot of conversation about possibility of landlines, concerns about when areas don't have wire cell coverage. And then we did have a conversation about no-co alerts and possibilities there. So then in addition to that, we also talked about our current referral process to see how it is working for the fire districts. And then they did mention that, notifying fire districts of short-term rental approvals was something that would work in the future. So overall, it was a really great conversation. And I do believe that we'll get some good numbers. And just for your own information, we did have Estes Valley was in attendance, Poudre Fire Authority was also in attendance, and then we did get feedback from Pinewood Springs Fire District, which is in the Lyons area. So the next step, in addition to having these other stakeholder conversations, we've also done a comparative analysis of short-term rental regulations. So Larimer County communities were looked at in that process. So that is the document we were mentioning earlier that just compares some of the language we see in other communities, and that is posted online on the project website. I also can stop sharing this in just one moment and we can bring that up and take a closer look. But real quick, the Larimer County communities that we did look at were essentially all the communities within Larimer County. The city of Fort Collins, the town of Tinmouth, and then of course the town of Estes Park are the three counties or the three jurisdictions in the county that do currently have regulations, whereas the others such as Loveland, Berthoud, Wellington do not currently have short-term rental regulations. And then the other communities in Colorado that were looked at or listed here, which included like Boulder County, Grand County, City of Aspen, Town of Vail, amongst others. And then other communities outside of Colorado at this time that we have taken a look at is Santa Cruz. And so I can quickly stop sharing this screen and share. Bear with me one sec. And then I will share the breakdown, so the short-term rental regulations review project and the analysis. So we made a nice table that breaks it down into specific topics and then regulation language per jurisdiction. So we noted the language, and then following is what jurisdiction provided that language. So this is really looking at the short-term rental regulations and when they go above and beyond what we currently have. So using this as possible examples moving forward, where we can maybe capture some language if we, based upon how they address specific issues that we are currently considering. So like the first 3 pages of this will be the local communities. So City of Fort Collins, Town of Estes, and Town of Timnath. And then the last 4 pages are specific to Colorado in general. So again, going back to Pitkin County, Boulder County, Aspen. And I don't know how much of this we should get into, and Leslie, I can let you chime in if we want to touch upon some of this, or how deep we should maybe look into this right now.
I would
Yeah,
prefer-
The reference tool, and it's good information that we'll probably continue to add to as we learn of other examples. The idea is, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of jurisdictions doing different things. We obviously want to come up with the right approach for Larimer County and in particular in the Estes Valley. And so we are just taking a good look around at the jurisdictions that are working on this. We are finding that in Colorado and really across the West and around the US that many jurisdictions are on their second or third version of this. So I think what we're talking about is not unique to Larimer County. And so we're trying to make sure we're getting the most current information and state of the art best practice approaches that different communities are looking at. So I see Commissioner Shattuck McNally with her hand up.
Thank you, Director Ellis. I just wanted to know if we've reached out to Routt County or to the City of Louisville. They have some other options that I just want to understand why and how they approach that and how they mitigate. And I don't know if we had, mostly I want to understand why and understand how they came to that conclusion and kind of have a conversation with those two. I don't know if we've had that opportunity to do that. I've spoken with the mayor and the commissioners and some other elected officials in those areas, and they have shared their thoughts with me. And I just wanted to see if you had a chance to maybe talk with those staff. I know it's another piece of work, but I just thought another thing in the work plan, but I just thought maybe just to be worth the conversation, just so I can understand where staff were from too on that. So I don't know if you would consider that.
We have not spoken with staff there specifically, but we can. And Routt County in particular does not allow short-term rentals. They have restricted them. And Louisville, I'm a little less familiar. We are familiar also with Breckenridge, Steamboat, some of the other cities in the mountains. They just didn't make it into the table yet, but we've been looking at some of the work that they've been doing also. So we can include that information for the next round.
That'd be great. I knew what Routt County had looked at that. I'm just curious about the interaction between the town and the county. And then also, they're still having trouble with enforcement and having still ones that are not still operating. And so I just wanted to try to see how they came to that conclusion and how they're managing that and their enforcement. Just some ideas, just to I'd like to just look into the why and how they do that after having those conversations at some of our conferences lately. Thanks. I appreciate you considering that.
All right, Frank, I see Drew's got his hand up too. Do you want to start some conversation among the committee? I'll turn it back over to you if you want to manage that piece.
Absolutely. Drew, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just a general question. If in all these different areas that have been looked at, is there any particular area that stands out that is that their process processes seem to be working the best?
Well, you know, what we've found, and actually a number of us came back from the planning conference a couple of weeks ago too, and I participated in a session on short-term rentals, and just about everybody in the room raised their hands and said they're working on this because it's really challenging. Every community is finding it to be kind of unique to their area. It depends whether they're a city or a mountain town or a resort community. And so the needs are very specific to the area. Enforcement is challenging. Coming up with just the right kind of approach and right size for the community is something that many, many towns and counties are working on right now. So as far as like identifying the best and the ones that are doing it just right, I don't know that anybody has this kind of dialed in just perfectly. I think there are a lot of good examples out there, and there probably are things that we're learning that are particularly complicated or harder to manage. But this is definitely a learning process for a lot of us.
I'm assuming license transfer is probably on the top of most people's issues.
Yeah, it is. And we found that of the many of the communities we looked at, most of them have moved in the direction of not allowing transferability. And you see that in this table. Now, that doesn't mean that nothing can ever be transferred. A lot of them grandfather in certain things, or they define it certain ways. But for the most part, many of the examples that are currently out there say a license shall not be transferred. And many of them just say that very specifically. So I know that's something we've talked about a lot here, and something that we'll continue to look at. And we probably need to come back with some different ideas around that. And, you know, maybe, you know, we are looking closely at what the town of Estes is doing and seeing if that, you know, makes sense to try to align the county and the town. But that's an area where a lot of jurisdictions have kind of tended more in the direction of saying these aren't transferable.
Thank you.
Ton and Leslie, you looking for us to give you, specific recommendations today? And do you have any specific recommendations that you all are making at this time that we should hear before we carry on too much conversation?
Yeah, Frank, so we don't have a draft, as we pointed out, and Ton noted that by the end of this month, by the 25th, we will have drafts. And so at your next meeting, that would be the time to probably make a more formal recommendation. I think we are still gathering input and ideas, and would like to hear your feedback. And if it's helpful, you know, Ton could maybe go back to the slide that lists the various topics that are, you know, still on the table and still being investigated and still being looked at. We can dive in with you a little bit more into the examples from other communities. And if you want to make suggestions to us of things that you prefer or like or don't like, or things that you'd like us to further explore, I think this is all, that would all be really great input at this stage, because the next couple of weeks are going to be hard at work drafting and coming up with some specific language that can then be available for the public review, and then going into kind of before, you know, pre-hearing language and work session language and that kind of thing. So, so I think we're, you know, we can go through the list, or we can just have an open discussion. It's really kind of up to how you all.
I have a suggestion, and actually it was Rex's suggestion as well, that we break down our discussion by, and I believe this focuses on the Estes Valley most important issues we've discussed, into a discussion about short-term rental licenses in non-residential zoning, short-term rental licenses in residential zoning, and then that especially in areas that are unusual, like Windcliff, and then short-term rentals in established residential neighborhoods. And if that makes sense, we can come back to specifics, but that gives us an organization for the discussion. And we're not bouncing back and forth between the different ones. And I saw Dave's hand up, but I would kick that off by saying, hey, I still feel strongly that in non-residential zoning districts, A and A1, that they should be allowed. That's, I would think there might be some attorneys that would argue that's a use by right through zoning, is intended zoning for accommodations, which is short-term rentals. And I believe that the license in those zoning should be transferable. And I actually think the application process could be made simpler. And I'll defer, Dave. I can't see everybody. Do you still have your hand up? No?
I took it down so we could follow your organization structure,
All right.
but I do
I
have a
would
question for Todd, if I might. And that is,
yes.
a lot of people I talk to indicate that there's a difference between a house that's rented 365 days a year and one that's rented 10 days a year. That they have a different feeling about its impact on the neighborhood. But I didn't see that as one of the options in your still alive pile. Did I miss something?
I can address that if you'd like. That is presented as an example in the tables that Ton was showing. So a number of jurisdictions do have license types, and they will distinguish types of licenses that are issued for year-round rental versus a more limited approach, like maybe 135 days a year or 90 days a year, we've seen commonly. And they will sometimes distinguish those also as to whether it's host occupied or not host occupied. And so with the idea being that the types of rentals that are more unlimited, that don't have, days per year limits, would happen in more of a resort type zoning district, whereas the ones that are more limited might happen in more of a residential type district. So we do see that in a lot of jurisdictions. And if that is a direction that you're interested in further exploring, we could look at that a little bit more closely too.
I would be interested, although I don't know that enforcement is possible.
Several of these ideas people or other communities are looking at have enforcement issues if you dig into it. So Rex, did you have a comment?
Yeah, sticking with that category of accommodations or commercial zoning, I think we can kind of concentrate on that first and dispense with it relatively quickly. In addition to what you mentioned about transferability and streamlining, I would add, I think this is an area where public hearing is not required, where when we get to, quiet residential neighborhoods, I would feel much differently. So I'd like to add that to your suggestions. And I also think it's certainly a category where staff can do the review and approvals. Wouldn't require planning commission necessarily, or this kind of a group for advice along your streamlined areas. But I'd be interested in see whether any of the other committee members think that there are more stringent requirements required in those zoning areas.
Well, Drew's got his hand up. Drew, do you have?
Yeah, just a quick question. I'm assuming that there's no consideration in accommodation zoned areas for density.
Well, density is required differently in those two zonings. That's the big difference, is how many
Yeah,
units.
but I'm assuming that we have no issues with density in accommodation zone areas.
Not that I'm aware of.
And I certainly wouldn't have an issue there. Well, let's ask staff, is there any reason why they think that we should be concerned about density other than what's already established for the two different accommodation zones?
The zones themselves are limited in density according to the land use code and the use tables and whatnot. So you wouldn't get more density than what's allowed through that. And I think when you talk about density in this sense, it's a question of whether short-term rentals within those districts should be capped in some way. So I think as long as you're comfortable with the density that's currently allowed in those districts for accommodation type uses and short-term rentals are part of that, then that's how that would be addressed.
Frank, I don't think that there should be caps in those areas either. I mean, we don't have caps on the motel.
No, and I don't think the cap applies to them now, does it?
Oh,
Leslie? Yeah.
Could I ask a question about that?
Yes.
I'm a little clear about the difference between A1 and A in the sense of what's the low use and high use. I understand the high use pretty straightforward. I don't know what the cap is on low use. I mean, I don't know what the limit is. I don't know the difference between those two in terms of how many people per square inch or square mile or square per acre would be allowed to be rented out of the A1 versus the A.
Well, it's 4 units per acre, right, Leslie? In A1.
Sorry, couldn't get my mute button. I think that's right. Unfortunately, our resident expert isn't here today, Michael. I would usually turn to him and have him answer that question. I don't, Sean or Atan, do you know, or Matt? Matt may be looking it up.
I've developed a lot of A1 in the Estes Valley, and it's 4 units per acre. That does allow for different unit types, separate individual duplexes or multi-unit, if I remember correctly.
I've just put up on the screen the EVA and the EVA1 zone districts density standards. So talks about an area's square footage. It looks like I haven't read this before, so I'm kind of at a loss. Maybe you can help us out with this.
Can
Frankie.
I help you out? EVA, all those like units per
Right here.
1 per 1,800 square feet, that's a
Mhm.
hotel kind of density. The
Single families at 9,000 square foot per lot,
yeah,
and two
And-
family 67. So that can,
multifamily is that's basically 8 per acre.
Yep.
In multifamily, and EVA1 is 4 units per acre.
yep. So there you have it. Those are the numbers.
Okay, so you feel that if you had 8 people renting a single place, you could have 64 people on an acre and that'd be okay.
I can't see how you regulate that.
All right, that may be a fair statement, but I do have people ask me what the difference is practically. So I'm just trying to understand when it gets to be too much in the A1 zone.
Yeah,
Well,
Matt,
I would suggest that, and Leslie and Tanya, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but our objective would be that short-term rentals really be applied primarily to short-term or to single-family residences. So once you get into a multifamily or a setting or something like that, it's considered a lodge or something else that can be approved as an alternate use, not as a short-term rental. So if I was proposing to do a multifamily unit and just put a bunch of short-term rentals in that multifamily unit, then I would probably call that a resort lodge under that accommodation zoning, and I would get the approval as a resort lodge rather than as a short-term rental. And that the short-term rentals are confined to more of the single-family uses that are provided in that zone district. Leslie, is that how you understood it?
Yes, but I think we do need to define that better, like maybe define what that multiple use type is, because we don't really have a good definition for that right now. So, but I think it makes sense, as Matt's saying, to distinguish between the single standalone homes that might be in that district versus the condo type units that might be in that district.
Well, remember, the reason that the district was established was because we had so many, and still have so many cabin type lodging facilities that are, you know, by definition, single family. So it's a little confusing to use that term, but they're really intended for cabin type or freestanding condominium type facility at a lower density than a hotel.
And I think we're probably getting into some details that we can continue to work on for the
Yeah.
draft, as long as we understand your general desires and intent for these districts, because we probably have more analysis that we need to do and probably some more definitions and that kind of thing. So I think if you give us your general sense of what you think would be appropriate or not appropriate, then we'll have some opportunities to keep refining that with you in the next iterations.
Yep, I agree. And but before we move on to the residential zoning, Michael or Amy, anybody else have any comments about the accommodations zoning? You're muted, Mike. Mike,
Yes,
you're muted. Okay.
I'm just trying to catch up.
Well, the initial comments were so far pretty much pro allowing short-term rentals and maybe making it easier in the accommodation zoning.
I agree with that.
Okay, Amy, did you have any comments? If you're commenting, I can't see you, so you may be muted. Rex?
Yeah, my final comment on the two accommodation zoning as far as STRs go is that in the A zoning, things should be compared to motels. In the A1 zoning, things should be compared to the historic established cabins along the main rivers. We've got very good long-term established uses in those categories, and that they would be very good comparisons for dealing with STRs in those two categories. Thank you.
Yep. I'd also add, we have a whole lot of those are condominium. They may not have started as condominium complexes, but they are now. Either they were converted or newer developments in A1 developed as condominium complexes, like Bear Paw is a big one up on Fall River. There's several all over town. And if we don't have any other comments on that, you want to move on to, anybody have any thoughts on the residential zoning districts? And first, specifically about, should we recommend allowing short-term rentals in certain zoning, like in very low density zoning, and or we have at least one clear kind of oddity like at Windcliff, and there may be others I'm unaware of, where Windcliff is essentially all short-term rentals, but it's zoned residential. Any, yeah, Drew?
Yeah, I mean, you know, this has been a point of concern for all of us, but I still think some of the conversations I've heard basically in residential areas is really, should there be a particular cap in a neighborhood based on density. Should there be separation requirements between short-term rentals and residential, neighborhoods? And getting back to the case of neighborhood compatibility. I think we've talked about that a lot. And I think the question is, what is too much? And I know that they've looked into, density issues, and I think that that will lead to probably making some pretty good decisions on that.
I agree.
Rex?
Yeah, I don't think the group is honed in on your special category here. If we're talking about these special categories, and we're not talking about established residential neighborhoods, but these special categories that happen to be residentially zoned, like Wingcliff. Leslie, are some of those cabins along the river, or are they in residential zoning rather than accommodation zoning? That would be another category.
Yeah.
You're nodding your head. And also, I would throw into the same thing from what I've seen on our applications and what I've seen over watching this particular topic the last couple of years in town as well. I find that there's a lot of opportunities for these to exist on larger properties. Certainly, 10 acres, I can't imagine there'd be much of a problem. And on 2.5 acres or 5 acres, there might not be a problem. I think that maybe we would certainly want a different application and approval review process than we would on a more relaxed accommodations zoning for those special areas. But I do see an opportunity in our particular valley that, since we have those conditions, that we ought to think about a special category here in the residential zoning. That's a little easier, I think, to deal with than the problem of STRs in established residential neighborhoods.
Right. I tend to agree with you about the lower density 10 acre, 5 acre, that we ought to give consideration to continuing to allow STRs there at the very least. Commissioner, you got your hand up?
I just want to caution you all to kind of think about wildfire hazard areas, response times, water, those kinds of things. And I think those are kind of important things to consider when you get some of these larger homes and larger lots, where they're located and what they're next to, and just to kind of keep the whole picture in mind. I just want to kind of make sure that if you look at allowing those, I still think that for me, from what I've been hearing, is just the hazard, the extra increased risk for wildfire and other things, and response times that we're having issues with in the valley right now that I've been hearing about. So I just kind of want to keep that in mind as you guys are having this discussion. Thank you.
Right. Mike?
Yes, I think in these 5 acre and 10 acre lots, I mean, yeah, you don't have the density neighbor to neighbor, but you have other considerations, and that being, as Jody pointed out, wildfire, but you also have the considerations of wildlife. And, I would hate to see 10 acre or 5 acre STRs in the middle of wildlife mitigation routes, or even close to them. Because I think these people are generally noisier than the rest of us.
Well, just a correction, they're not wildlife mitigation routes, they're wildlife migration groups. We don't mitigate wildlife in Estes Park.
All I'm drinking Coke.
All right, this is random because it's on how it appears on my screen. But I got Drew next.
Yeah, I just, kind of want to support what Mike just said, maybe not mitigation. But certainly in support of what the commissioner mentioned about about wildfire areas, I think certainly wildlife corridors, should be added to that consideration as well.
Okay. And Rex,
I certainly don't want to be in a position of not agreeing with the commissioner, but I would like to build on her comment. Those kinds of things that she and Mike mentioned are the kinds of things that should come up in the review, or the kinds of things that should come up in a more serious fire district review of these kinds of applications than we have now. They're the kinds of things that the planning department can take a look at, the wildlife hazard areas, and maybe require some more restrictions, or require, for instance, lower fences so the wildlife can get through the property. These are the kinds of things, the details that can come up during the review process. I don't think they're the kinds of things that might reach the level of not permitting STRs in those kinds of larger property settings.
yep, Commissioner,
Thanks again. I just wanted to let you know, I received 2 complaints for illegally feeding wildlife at STRs this week in Estes Valley. So it's a weekly conversation we're having. And I also been talking to some commissioners in other counties that they're starting to have some thoughts about certain wildfire hazard areas in certain areas near national forests that they're thinking about now allowing STRs in certain areas close to the forest and certain parks and stuff, just because of the risk. So I just wanted to kind of just share some of those conversations, because I don't think this problem is unique to us, as we mentioned before, but I just wanted to kind of bring that up, because as Leslie shared, they talked a lot about, she was on that panel, they talked a lot about this at their conference, and I'm hearing it, we talk a lot about it monthly with commissioners across the state. So I just kind of wanted to share that. Thanks.
And I think that's an important consideration, because it falls into the area of things that are difficult to enforce, prevent up front. And of course, reacting after the fact is too late. So I do think those are good points, but I don't think they're exclusive to STRs. I think they're problems that are maybe more general. Now, if we have some statistics that show, and I think there are some statistics on fires in residences that are STRs that are much higher than in non-STRs, and that's understandable because the renters don't have that concern. They aren't vested in the property. So I think these are valid questions, but I just want to caution us on saddling STRs with problems that we need to solve on a broader basis.
Dave and Leslie, if you can hang on a second, I want to take this opportunity to mention, because Rex mentioned the STR and some of these fire statistics. And I think Ton could clarify this after your meeting with the fire district. But I'm not sure if this committee's heard it before, but some of the data that was put out by the fire district that indicated percentages of fires where they were short-term rentals was not specific to short-term rentals. It was actually non-resident occupied. Correct, Ton?
Unfortunately, I can't provide clarification on that. We didn't get into any of the specifics on, reporting, unfortunately.
The chief, David Wolf, clarified with me that some of those statements that were put out early on, they were identified as a very large percentage, a majority of the fires they responded to were in STRs, when in fact it was a broader based category that included things like bed and breakfast, some slightly longer term rentals, a variety of things. They weren't all STRs, but they were non-resident occupied. Still, valuable data that shows a tendency to have more fires in those areas. Sorry, I just wanted to tell the board all that. David?
So I think it's important to think about the comprehensive plan that's being developed in the land use categories and what their purpose is. So I think I'm not ready to jump like Rex is onto the 5 and 10 acre lots and saying, yes, short-term rentals, go for it. I think that's not consistent with some of the land use categories that we have in mind here. And the response time is a really important thing here. We do not get good response time out where I live. It's a long way for the constables to come. I mean, it's understandable. They've got a large area to cover, and the fire department takes a while to get out there. But they've been really good. So I'm not complaining. But I think we need to be very careful, given the land, what we're trying to put together for the comprehensive plan, that it matches our plan for short-term rentals.
Okay. Leslie, you had your hand up. Did you have something?
Yeah, I'll just build on some of the comments earlier about jurisdictions that are looking at more remote districts. And I will follow up and send you all the table that's posted online. And for people who are attendees and watching, it is on the Larimer.gov planning webpage under our short-term rental project. And that does include Pitkin County that actually further restricts short-term rentals in areas that are more remote or adjacent to Forest Service lands. In some cases, they have different sets of standards. So I think there's some examples that we can look at there. I am curious from this group what you think densities might look like in the Estes Valley. As we've looked at different communities and as they've looked at residential areas, we're seeing that they're capping short-term rentals anywhere from like at 15%. We saw in Avon in certain residential areas, 30% in town of Crested Butte in certain residential areas. And we haven't finished all of our analysis yet in the Estes Valley, but it's looking like, for example, in Carriage Hills, that's been an area that we've had a number of proposals that currently we're at about 7% maybe. Those are just preliminary rough numbers, but pretty, what would seemingly be low even compared to what some of these other communities are setting limits at. And so I think we'd be curious to hear from you when you talk about different areas of the valley and larger lots versus smaller lots and that kind of thing. What does seem to be about the right level? And Drew, I think, mentioned separations and distances. And so if you have any particular thoughts around that, I think that would be helpful. And we can take that and do some more further analysis and look at other communities and that kind of thing. So in part, some information, in part, a question to you all. Thanks.
And I think you're segueing to the larger category of general residential areas, not just these exceptions. Rex, did you?
Yeah, I was gonna make the distinction, in these special areas, Windcliff has extremely high density. It's established for a long time on the STRs. On larger lots where we have relatively few of these so far, and there are, of course, wildfire and other considerations, especially where those lots are located and where the STR would be located. These percentages that we're getting from these communities have really very little relevance. I think there are other things that are more relevant to us in considering locations on large lots. Also, I want to warn about this kind of information from other communities. I had a condo amongst many STRs in Avon for almost 25 years. I have a lot of experience with that HOA. I have a lot of experience with the neighborhoods there. And a new community like Avon has a tremendous amount of accommodations and zoning for those kinds of uses. They have very little of it in residential areas because they have so much of it in accommodation zoning. So I want to be very cautious about using information from other communities on a specific basis. I think their languages and their concepts are very useful to us. But when it comes down to determining what kind of statistics, what kind of caps, what kind of limits that we need for this valley, we have to really consider what the public are saying and what groups like this group are thinking that would be right for the community long-term. So I just want to make that distinction on the information we get when we look at other communities.
Mike, you had your hand up.
Yes, Leslie, I know the statistics are helpful in analyzing these situations, but for instance, in Carriage Hills, I'm told that there's a lady there that has an STR on all four sides of her house. And that should never have happened.
Okay, Rex, or I mean, Drew.
Yeah, I just, you want to comment on what Rex was saying? The percentages are pretty difficult, I think, to establish. I mean, if we look at Carriage Hills and the experience that we've had there with the density issues that we've heard from residents there, and right now there's only 7%. That doesn't sound like very much, but it seems like we're getting a lot of complaints out of 7%. So if you start looking at 25 and 30%, what does that tell you? So I guess Rex, I'd ask you, how do you think we should look at this density issue and separation issue?
Well, I think it's difficult, and I think it's maybe very important if we are going to continue to allow short-term rentals in established residential neighborhoods. I think it's an important issue, but I think, I happen to live next to 2 STRs or adjoining my property. I'm on an acre and a half, and of the five surrounding properties, 2 of them are STRs. One of them is licensed for 8 occupants, the other is licensed for 16. And the behavior of the visitors there is very different, and it's due to the owners. The smaller one is not rented out very often, 10, 12 times a year. And actually, when the owners are there, they make more noise than most of the renters that they have. The large one is completely different. It's large enough for wedding parties and things like that, and large family reunions. And they can be very noisy after 9 o'clock. They put the kids to bed and they go outside so they can make the noise and not disturb the kids. So it really is different. You can't generalize, I don't think, from those kinds of experiences. But the fact that there are 2 of them together, the surrounding properties really suffer. So, maybe you need at least 1 property in between or 2 top properties in between. But I mean, it's very difficult, as Leslie would tell you, for a planning staff to regulate those kinds of things. So I think it's an important subject, Drew, but I think that, this committee is not capable of coming up with a solution that would really work, and be enforceable long-term.
David?
Thanks.
Okay. Well, I think I've heard the same thing that a couple of times now. It's not just the percentage, but it's where it is and also how often it is, which is really the challenge. So you could put it's not that hard to measure distance between a house and another house, but it makes it harder. But also, if you're going to rent it out 12 times a year, like Rex mentioned for one of the renters, it's a whole different feel than if it's rented out 365 days a year, if they're so lucky. And so you're looking for advice or suggestions on directions to go. I think you have to include both those factors in play, because it's a very, if Rex had a neighbor that only rented it out 12 times a year in both locations, he might have a different opinion. And so I don't think you can just have percentages that we saw on the charts. I think it's it's not going to work very well.
All right, Mike.
You know, it seems to me in the research I've been doing that we are very easy on our short-term rental regulations. You know, I've seen places where it has to be the owner's principal residence is being rented out, and they have to be a resident of that particular area. I've seen places where they just have a multitude of very strict regulations. And I know that the Estes Valley Short-Term Rental Alliance was formed, but I think they need to understand too that they've got a bird's nest on the ground here.
All right, and I have a comment about the percentage approach. And just to clarify for those who are listening who aren't familiar with it, a lot of communities are looking into, say, in a neighborhood, a discrete neighborhood, and Carriage Hills would be a good example here that's in the county, establishing, you know, a cap of, say, 30%, for example, of those homes can be short-term rentals and no more. One of my biggest concerns about that and any of these more detailed regulations is enforcement, because that's just going to be really difficult to enforce. And there are a lot of people who, if they run up against it, are going to be trying very hard to find loopholes. The more detailed those kind of regulations become, they get harder and harder for staff to enforce. Just a general concern with that approach. Drew, did you have another comment?
Yeah, I've had coffee with a couple of members of the Estes Park STR Alliance, and you know, I think this is a real positive step in the right direction. I mean, I think that group could make a great contribution to STR issues as well as opportunities, and being able to organize and to set guidelines with membership and also enforcement too. And I know that, you know, those people that have legal short-term rentals, you know, they have their own issues with the non-legal short-term issues. So I think that this new alliance could make a huge contribution to the STR industry in the Valley.
An additional comment I wanted to make, this has come up in some of the conversations regarding the comp plan, that the Estes Valley, we have a unique situation, unlike a lot of other suburban and small town, small city communities, where we have these really weird mixed up neighborhoods. I don't know if you even call them neighborhoods. They're geographic areas that have everything from a, you know, $1.5 million house to 100-year-old shacks that are rented out. We have some neighborhoods that are fairly consistent, homogeneous, but we have a whole lot that aren't. And it makes it harder to overlay things in areas like that, like percentages or caps, because almost every area I can point to in town, you get very, especially in the county, the area down along Marys Lake Road, it's just such a mixed bag. And it's one of the reasons I still, is kind of a purist position, but I really feel like one of the best ways to handle it in the Estes Valley would be to simply not issue any more STRs in residential zonings. But I think making an allowance to allow them in large lot locations, maybe 2.5+ acres, and those special places that are non-conforming, if you will, like Windcliff. That's my thought. Yeah, Drew?
I hear what you're saying, Frank. I don't disagree. I'm just, what I'm wondering out loud is that, who makes those determinations and what are the criteria for those special situations?
I think that would be relatively easy to do, where you have situations where their zoning is residential, but the propensity of the use, like Windcliff, is short-term rentals. Rex?
Yeah, let me just follow up on that, since both you and I see some flexibility in those kinds of situations. What about, should a public hearing be required for approval in those areas? We already talked about the possibility of not needing a public hearing for STRs applied in accommodations zoning. But in these special areas of residential zoning where they might be more permissible, should a public hearing be required or not?
I personally feel like it would be good to treat them exactly like you would accommodation zoning. And maybe they could be identified as a non-conforming, even apply for designation somehow.
Well, I'm going to argue with the other side of it, especially in the larger lots. To me, it's where they're located. And I think the surrounding public probably needs an opportunity to weigh in on that.
Oh, I would agree with that, Rex, for the large lot.
Yeah,
I was referring to like a Windcliff situation.
yeah, Windcliff is different. So maybe even within this special category you and I are suggesting, there has to be some differences. And I could see that. But it's you and I, we need to hear from the rest of the committee on that kind of use.
Yes, and David's got his hand up and Mike does.
So one thing this new presentation of using large lots as perhaps a special area is not something I had thought about, but for a lot, but I do not favor it. I might favor it if it were the primary home or domicile of the owner. But if it's something that's a commercial venture, that's a business, and it's just run as a hotel basically for 16 people because it happens to be remote, then I think that violates the whole rules that we're trying to set up in the comprehensive plan for what the purpose of that area is. I didn't hear any caveats like that. That worries me. So I didn't sign up to have a hotel next to my house if I have more than 2.5 acres. That's not a key thing for me. And 16 people is a lot of people. So, I mean, I think you guys got to back off a little bit, think through this a little bit more. And I think I'd highly recommend that maybe we start talking about what is a business and what's a short-term rental. Because I'm not sure I understand how to tell the two apart in some people's minds. To me, if you're running 365 days, 16 people in there, it's a hotel. That's how I grew up. That would be a hotel. If we want to call it a short-term rental and say it's not a business and that it can be in a residential zone, then I have a real problem understanding what the difference is.
David, I personally think any short-term rental is by definition a business. Mike, did you have another comment?
Well, David
Linda.
kind of took the wind out of my sails because I really do agree with him. My complaint against residential short-term rentals in residential areas is that they are in fact a commercial enterprise. Some of them are small operations, but others are corporations, and people are owning 3 and 4 STRs, and they don't even come to Estes Park. I think we need to tighten some of these regulations, and I think that if it's truly a business, it shouldn't be in a residential area. I guess that's what I have to say.
You're with me. Linda.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. I'm sorry, I'm doing a phone and a computer. I've been having a crazy time. Has anything been done to inquire about provisional permits for these people? I know we've had so much discussion from people that have come on and said, you know, this guy's a bad actor, he's not doing his job, he's not managing his property well. Are there areas, Leslie, in the state of Colorado, or is that even an area that we have looked at as far as maybe instigating a provisional permit for a year or a specific amount of time to see, and then recanvassing to see if the neighbors are unhappy or pleased or satisfied, dissatisfied?
So
Leslie?
provisional permits I haven't seen. A lot of jurisdictions do have an annual license renewal period. Many of them will consider the status of complaints and kind of how that particular short-term rental has performed during that period. And if there is a history of complaints or violations, they might not renew the license, or they might revoke the license. I've seen different tiered approaches to how that's done in terms of the severity of the violation, if it's a safety type of violation versus more of a nuisance violation. So there are different things that different communities are doing. Some of the ordinances for compliance are more strict in that they move more quickly toward revocation. So if by provisional you mean, you know, give that operator a chance to operate, but you know, pull the license away if they violate something, some condition of their approval. Yes, there are a number of communities that have moved in that particular direction, but just giving a license that's a temporary license isn't something that I've seen. So hopefully that helps answer the question. And some of that is in that table that I sent out to everybody, and we can do a bit more digging and see what others are doing along those lines too.
I would like to see that done. And as part of that 2016 task force for short-term rentals, we were the ones that came up with this cap recommendation. And my concern, frankly, is that people have gone through this process. They come up for approval. Many times they have spent a lot of money making their home health and safety compliant. And because there may be one other short-term rental in their area, and they happen to be in a residential area, you know, we just tend to blanketly disapprove of them. And it just seems to me that there's got to be a better way. And whether it's a provisional permit, or whether it's, you know, the people in Carriage Hills that are upset that they've got people around them, why haven't they formed a homeowner group to establish their own rules and regulations? I mean, we have one in Little Valley. You can't rent for less than 30 days.
Okay, I will take additional comments. Got Rex and Mike both have their hands up.
Rex?
Okay, I'll go first. I was just wanting to respond to some previous comments. First of all, Lynn's comments. I think regardless of the zoning and location of an approved STR, that they should be reviewed either on a yearly basis or on some provisional first-year basis. I think that's a very good idea. It makes the owners much more aware of the community's involvement and interest, and the regulations and the government's interest in controlling, having the owners control their properties. Coming further back to the question of owner occupied short-term rentals, say on a large property where you've got a large, 5 or 6 bedroom place, and the owners want to rent out a couple bedrooms as STRs during the 4 or 5 summer active visitor months. I wanted us to consider always making a distinction between an owner occupied property and what I call an STR. To me, an owner occupied property that's rented out like a B&B is completely different. The fact that the owner is there makes a big difference in my mind. STRs in my mind are where the owner is not there. And to me, they need more regulation.
I agree with that. Mike,
Rex, I also agree with that. But as to Linda's point, if the county commissioners were to choose to slowly deregulate or regulate or eliminate the caps or reduce the caps on short-term rentals, I would imagine that they would do something that would be announced now and be effective maybe a couple of years from now. But the other thing I wanted to talk about was, enforcement, as we all know, is a big part of this problem. And I know in the current regulations, at least under enforcement and revocation and appeal, that should the county incur costs in responding to a short-term rental, that those costs ought to be passed on to the owner. And I think that might help regulate it to some degree.
all right. Drew?
Yeah, just a comment on what Rex was saying about owner occupied. I've heard some different stories regarding owner occupied and bed and breakfast, and being owner occupied doesn't necessarily mean that the owners are there on the premise. And I think a lot of people think that this is a workaround, so to speak, in order to get a short-term an easier way to get a short-term license. So I just put that out there as a cautionary thought, because I've had more than one person bring that up to me.
And I've got Drew and Rex, or no, Mike and Rex.
I
I
forgot.
don't know, is that age before duty?
In my old age, I forgot to lower. my-
Older than he is.
I don't know. Who's up? Mike,
I lost my train of thought.
oh, well, then we'll let the commissioner
See, I'm
speak.
older than you are, Rex.
You are older, yeah.
I just wanted to tell you, I need to head off to a statewide mental health conversation and mental health discussion statewide. And I'm sure you're all feeling a little drained yourselves. I just want to thank you all and staff for organizing and all the data and information bringing. And I really am finding your conversations thought-provoking, and I really appreciate the discourse and the conversations that you guys all have, and the thoughtful time you're taking to discuss this and think about everyone in the Valley and how this all interacts. And I just want to thank you for having this extra meeting and an extra time and go above and beyond in your service. And so I apologize for leaving early, but I need to attend this other forum, and just wanted to say thank you and thanks for letting me be a part of the conversation. And I wish you all a safe evening and safe travels. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And
Commissioner.
thank you for all the attention you give us in Estes. We appreciate it. And keep thinking of us as your special child. Yes, David.
So I thought maybe now we're an hour and a half in, it might be useful to recap where I think we are. I think we've talked about the commercial A and A1, and there's not a lot of disagreement there. There's some necessary clarification on some definitions, particularly in the A1 zone, as Rex mentioned. So I think that one, we made some progress there. I think there are special districts that we talked about, like Windcliff, and I don't think anybody took exception to Windcliff. I think there were exceptions to some of the other special areas that were classified. We don't have a unanimous approval agreement on that, particularly with regard to the large lots. Now we're into the residential ones, and we're having trouble defining what is a residential occupation and what is a business occupation. That's where we got kind of hung up a little bit. We talked about owner occupied. We talked about other kinds of ways, bed and breakfast, that you can handle residential, or that you only rent out a few times a year. But we don't seem to address directly the question of what do we do with the corporation that runs STRs in our town. And maybe we should spend some time on that. And maybe we should spend some time on how do we define what we consider to be a residential area, and recognize that most of the residential areas in our valley do not have operating HOAs. They were formed when they initially formed the community, but many of them do not have them. And I do know that some of the applicants had told us that they looked for opportunities to buy properties where there were no active HOAs, so they didn't have to worry about that. So how do we manage this? And I heard Linda come up with a comment that her particular neighborhood has a very strong HOA and has dictated what they can and can't do in that area. But we're kind of in the quagmire now of the residential one. And I think we need to come up with some clear definitions of what it is that we're trying to regulate and what are the key factors. So that would be my suggestion for the next half hour if we're going to stay a whole another half hour. I'm up in northern New Hampshire. I'm hungry.
Rex, Rex and then Mike.
Yeah, first of all, I think there are a couple of things now that we're talking about the question of STRs in established residential neighborhoods. First of all, we've already got them. We already allow them. We have a cap on them. And the real question is long-term, what to do about it, whether or not to stick with what we're doing, whether or not to reduce them, whether or not to over time. And it would be a long period of time, I think, and plenty of notice, a year or two, like Mike says, whether or not to eliminate them. But let me come back to Drew's question about commercial or not commercial. I feel strongly that any STR is commercial. If it's only used as an STR half the year, then it's a commercial half the year. And if it's getting mortgage interest deductions from the IRS, then it's only going to be used by the owners 10% of the rental user time. And it's very commercial. So they're collecting sales tax. I think they ought to pay, commercial ones ought to pay property tax, commercial property tax. They ought to pay lodging tax. And maybe there's, a limit. Maybe if they're only renting it out for 50 days a year, they don't have to do all that stuff, but I think it's impossible to monitor and enforce. So I think strongly that we should be treating all the STRs as commercial operations. And the county already has some restrictions on commercial operations. Right now, my understanding of the regulations is that if you're an artist or a craftsman, you're the only commercial occupation that can have visitors come to your property and make purchases. You could operate home businesses of many other types as long as you don't have regular visitors and traffic and people coming to your property to do business with you. Coming back to the general questions, should we continue as we are with a cap and allowing STRs in established residential neighborhoods? Should we figure out some suggestions on how to reduce that over time? Or should we figure out recommending eliminating them over time? Those to me are the three questions.
Mike?
I have two things I'd like to say. Number one, regardless of where we come out on all this, enforcement is going to be the key. And if we can't enforce it, it doesn't make any difference what we do here. I would suggest that the short-term rental licenses be raised to cover the cost of county enforcement, which they're called in to deal with some of these facilities that really aren't very well regulated by the owners. That being what it is. The other thing I think is important to keep in mind is how did renting in the Estes Valley start out? Well, it started out in the 1850s, 1860s, with people coming up here to fish and looking for lodging with people who were already here, basically ranches. And it's kind of grown from that. Some of the people who had summer homes and rented them out, they ended up becoming tourist courts, auto courts, and what's now motels. Others have become dude ranches. But the idea wasn't that they would move into a residential area and have widespread commercial activities. And that's where I come out on this.
Okay, Drew?
Yeah, short-term rentals have been, as Mike said, been a part of this community for a long time. I think that, they obviously contribute to taxes, and from what I understand, it's a fairly large sum. So I think when we start talking about new restrictions and especially regulations, I go back to what I said earlier. I really do feel like that this new Estes Park Short-Term Rental Alliance has a great opportunity here. And I think that they are trying to organize and pull together some things that really might answer some of our questions, and certainly about enforcement guidelines, things of that sort. So, my recommendation would be, before we start regulating this, let's listen to what they have to say and what their plans are, because I believe there's some real opportunity there to address some of these situations that we're talking about.
Okay, Linda?
I agree with Drew, everything he said, and I will point out that our short-term rentals are paying commercial utility rates. They are paying local marketing district tax, and they're also paying sales tax. And now we're talking about a pillow tax of sorts to support workforce housing and that kind of thing. If you want to regulate something, you tax it to death. So in talking about making their property taxes commercial, how would you go about that? If my short-term rental, before I took it off the market, was rented 145 days a year, and it's no longer even on up for rental. So how would you justify charging somebody a commercial property tax rate or a higher mill than they would pay for a residential district? I think that would be just a nightmare. I'm in favor of guests who come here paying an extra tax above and beyond sales and local marketing district. But I think with the commercial rates on STRs already for utilities, that is a big leap to adjust their property taxes. Thank you.
Okay. I had a couple of comments in response to Dave's last comments. How do we define what areas we're talking about? We already have that zoning. It's very clear. And it's something that's malleable. People can rezone their property if they're not happy, or apply to. And in terms of defining what's a business or not, I think it's clear. Any STR, by definition, is a business. It's a money-making operation. Whether it's grandma renting out cabin she used to live in or a corporation, doesn't matter. It's a business. And I also want to make clear, when I say I think we should not allow any more STR in residential zoning, I'm not saying we take away anybody's existing STR licenses, that those that exist should exist. And I am respectful of that. And I respect it as an industry. But I do think we need to make changes. And we've heard that from our community members. And we're responding to a tectonic shift in the long-term, short-term rental that started with, I think it really goes back to Estes. It's different now. The VRBO Airbnb world and the internet hit us, and it's just exploded. So I think what we're doing is in response to that issue that everybody faces, but especially in a resort community. Any other comments before? I think at some point here, we probably should open it up to some public comment. Yes, Mike, you got your hand up.
I'll be real quick. In response to Linda's comment about the slippery slope of commercial real estate taxation, that could be dealt with under the same criteria that the utility deals with it when somebody decides not to be a short-term rental and go back to a residential billing. I just feel that enforcement, regardless of what we come up with, is going to be the key to success or non-success. And Frank, I agree with you that we shouldn't issue any more short-term rentals, but grandfather to those that are in. And as those properties either change hands or the owners decide no longer to be a short-term rental, then they're out of the pool.
Okay. Well, if there's no other comments by the board, Leslie, do you think we should open it up to public comment?
Yeah, that is entirely up to you. We have one person who has had a hand up for some time. So if you'd like to invite them to participate, do you want us to set a time limit?
Well, you might want to just poll the audience. I can't see them. You can. How many people would like to make comments, and we'll decide if we want to put a limit on it.
Okay, so if the attendees who are watching, if you'd like to make comments, please raise your hands. I see 2 hands currently raised. So as of now, we've got 3 people who would like to make comments.
Well, then I think we should allow them as much time within reason. Let's say 5 minutes tops, but please keep your comments to the point and no longer than necessary. I'll let you monitor that, Leslie.
Okay, so I've unmuted Deb Duffy. She's the first person, Duffy, to raise her hand. So Deb, if you'd like to make your comments, please do so.
Thanks, Leslie. It's okay. I answered to Duffy as well as Duffy because the T seems to go missing more often than not. I wanted to make a quick observation about the comment about HOAs. This comment also came up in the case of the roller coaster down the way from me. One of the challenges HOAs face is money. And when they're in charge of, they can draw up whatever they want, but when it comes to enforcement, they have to hire a lawyer, and that gets very expensive. I have a good friend who is in Carriage Hills, and we've had that conversation any number of times. So it's more complicated, I guess I would say, than the quick wave of get an HOA and just say no. The larger point I wanted to make is I used to live in Little Valley, actually, ironically, in the 80s. When I came back here, I read the existing development code and specifically chose the North End as the area that seemed least likely to be
developed an area that Estes seemed to recognize. And I hear it in the draft new comp plan, low density, low use, support agricultural use. I live here year round. I walk my dogs up and down Dry Gulch. It's 40 miles an hour. We have no sidewalks. We have very few stop signs. Over the past 2 weeks, I've tried to think clearly about every home I know out here. And I cannot come up with any home that has more than 2 occupants, even though the homes themselves could accommodate far more occupants. In seeking out a VRBO for Thanksgiving in a different community, there were, it was most common to see a 2-bedroom can sleep 9. When I think about what that translates to on, for instance, Dry Gulch Road, when I take my dogs for a 40-minute walk, I might be past, well, first of all, I'm in the middle of the street. The moment a car comes, I'm off in the grass. And after about 4 or 5 cars and a 40-minute walk, I'm kind of done. But generally that doesn't happen. When I picture a home as a VRBO, even with the most well-intentioned guests, I see that space maximized. Unlike the traditional guest ranches, and I live on the former Lazy Bee property, there isn't entertainment provided for the guests, right? They're going to be coming into town. They're going to go to the park. They're going to go out to eat. And so even just picturing one home, if I as an owner would want to maximize the value of that one home, there may be 2, 3, 4 cars associated with that home that are going to be going up and down Dry Gulch many more times a day than the residents who live out here. I guess my point is that in an area like this, which is so sort of underoccupied, changes that seem to make sense on paper. It's a 10-acre property. Surely they can accommodate X number of people. It won't take much to change the nature of living out here for those of us who do live out here. And I think that's worthy of consideration. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. Next up, we have William Brown. Oh, hold on one second. I'm moving a little slowly. Oops. Okay. I hit the wrong person. Okay. Bill, you should be able to unmute yourself and make your comments, and then Rich Chiappi will be next.
Great. Hey, thank you very much. This was very useful to hear this discussion. And unfortunately, I got a call from one of my sons at the start. I missed about the first 15 minutes, but I understand, Leslie, you're recording it. So I'll go back and look at the recording, I guess. Anyway, well, thank you for the spirited and thoughtful discussion about this. I've got really 2 comments on behalf of the Vacation Rental Alliance, and one that's personal to me. First of all, I know, we're going to have to take all of this back to our alliance and get their thoughts on it. But I do know that one thing the alliance feels strongly about is that there should be very serious enforcement with respect to non-licensed STRs. We think that's a major part of the problem. And lots of the complaints that are heard end up coming with respect to non-licensed STRs. Not all of them, of course, but some of them. And so we would support, I am certain, some pretty serious penalties for operating a non-licensed STR. And I think that's one thing I know that the Alliance will agree with. The other thing, it came up on the fire issue, and we're in the process of actually doing a white paper on this, but there was a lot of confusion and misstatements about that, as Frank pointed out. In fact, the complaints or the fire calls with respect to licensed STRs was only about 10 or 11% of total fire calls. And all the rest of those related to certain types of lodges, hotels were even included in there. So what the fire chief appeared to mean from that was simply non-owner occupied, as Frank indicated. There are also some other misconceptions. We'll deal with those later, but that's one of the key misconceptions that's out there, that STRs are a bigger fire risk. It does not appear from at least the reports that at least licensed STRs are a major problem with that. They are still a concern. It's a legitimate concern regardless. And so those are the comments on behalf of the Vacation Rental or Short-Term Rental Alliance. As an individual, I have one other comment. I moved here 2 years ago. My family's had a long-term relationship with the Valley, extending back to the 60s. My father developed land out here. And I spent years as a teenager working out here over the summers, et cetera. My concern on this is that it's important for the community that there's consistency between the town regulations and the regulations for the Valley outside of the town. We already have some issues with that because, of course, you don't get sales tax, town sales tax on these STR rentals outside of town, as an example. So to the extent possible, I personally think it's critically important that we minimize any differences in regulation between the town and the county in the Estes Valley. And by the way, that's not just with respect to STRs at all. You know, one time we had the development code was consistent between them. I've heard lots of stories about why that was terminated. It sounds like it had a lot to do with the personalities on the town board and the county commissioners, most of whom are no longer there. So I personally advocate some sort of return to a common regulation of land use in the Estes Valley. I'm not sure how we get about doing that, but seems to me to be a very important thing for the future of the community, not just with respect to STRs, but with respect to development generally. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Rich, you're up next. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Yep, just unmuted. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate you guys and the thoughtful conversation. I think you guys hit on a lot of very key and critical points, and it was a good discussion today. You know, Wincliffe's different. You know, you're signing off with Jody with us being the special committee, and it's like, well, then you can put Wincliffe down as the special case of the special, right? You know, I offer up only a few thoughts as it regards what we discussed today. The only fire that's burned down a house in Wincliffe was a full-time resident, right? It had nothing to do with the 53 years of vacation rental operations in Wincliffe. So, you know, when I hear stats thrown around like that, it's like, oh God, that one hurts. Same with the wildlife. I've got a seasonal resident that borders my property. They don't rent their house out as a short-term rental. They come up here and they party it up in the summer, and then they go home as soon as the breeze blows over 5 miles an hour and gets a little chilly. And they put out a salt lick, for God's sake, outside their house when they come up here so that the elk will come by. It's like these are homeowners that are supposed to be better than the short-term renters. They're not. They aren't behaving properly. And, you know, again, I want to protect my clientele in the sense that we do a great job communicating with these people. And frankly, they've done 80% of my guests are comebackers or word of mouth from people who've already been here. They know the routine, they know what to expect, and know how to behave. And so, you know, it can be done well, but I also know there needs to be a lot of tough decisions made about things that aren't like Wincliffe, with HOA covenants that specifically allow and codify the proper operation of a short-term rental. And then finally, I'll just leave you with this. You know, my 2 cents, you guys definitely made very good salient points, but I would take the opposite view, obviously, on these being commercial operations. These are family homes, All 40 of the homes I manage in Windcliff are family homes. And I just ran the numbers while you guys were talking. Our families use the homes on average 105 days a year this year. Our renters paid for 115 days a year on average. The homes are actually being used by their homeowners almost as much as we are able to rent them when they're not using them. So to call them commercial operations, first of all, they're bad businesses if that's the case. But the only real commercial operation in Windcliff is mine. You know, I'm the one with a parking lot and collecting taxes and having customers come and go. And, you know, again, we're unique in that regard, but I'm the commercial operation, but the houses, I don't see how they're businesses. But anyway, again, guys, all positive and all supportive. If you need anything from me, you know where to find me.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you. And that-
Leslie, do we have anybody else in the
we do
public?
not. No,
All right. Well, we got one board member with his hand up. Mike?
You know, it might be a good idea to have the Alliance come and tell us what they're all about. I mean, Drew's made some very positive comments and I take those to heart, but I think we ought to make time for them. And secondly, I'd like to give a big shout out to Matt et al. For the map they put together.
Shout out.
And I'll be the devil's advocate here and say, I think we need to be very careful in our engagement with special interest groups like this short-term rental alliance, because they are advocating for business interest. Yes, we need to hear from the business community, and I think we should be open to that, but I don't think they should get special treatment. And I think it's worth remembering that a lot of the people that we're supposed to be representing are not members of any kind of group.
Right.
The ones that are impacted, just your day-to-day citizen and resident. David, you got another comment?
I have a question for Leslie. She can listen to one more question, and that is, Leslie, did you get what you needed? Do we need to do something else for you? Because you have an October 25th deadline, which is very close.
well, I'm going to, I would say yes. Ton's going to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting though. So Ton, did you get what you needed?
I think so. I think a lot of, like, to Leslie's question about the densities, I think those are the challenges. I think we're all on the same page of the challenge of how that will look. So yes.
I
Good
would
luck.
second that question and add, do you all need some definitive recommendation from this board for the county commissioners before you present recommendations? And can we do that after you've drafted a draft ordinance that you're recommending?
So Frank, yes, we would want to get a definitive recommendation from this committee once we have a draft set of regulations ready. So that'll be November. Okay. Is that right, Ton? I've lost track of the dates, but I think it's probably at your next meeting. And so your recommendation would go to the Planning Commission and the Board of County Commissioners. The county commissioners are ultimately the approvers of any changes to our land use code, but they look to you all for your input and insights.
Well, the last time we had a joint meeting with them, I got a good dinner, so we'd be willing to go down and talk to them in person.
Well,
I'll agree with that.
On the 20th of October.
David, did you have another comment? I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's all right. I guess I interrupted. The 20th of October, I believe, is our next meeting, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And that will be a hybrid meeting. Are any of you planning to attend in person at the rec center? And the focus of that meeting will be the comprehensive plan. And you do have two short-term rental cases likely on the consent agenda in the A district that we would ask you to review and provide input on at that meeting as well. So those are the two topics for that agenda.
Could I suggest that you add a time slot to address anything you need help with for your October 25th event? If there's anything we can do to help you at that point in time, Tom, you're going to be running right on the wire there.
Yeah, I think we can probably put that in under just communication items or questions. If we have a question at that point or something that we're grappling with, we could bring that to you then. Yeah, otherwise we'll be in drafting mode. The next opportunity for you all and the public would then be that November 1st meeting to share your responses and thoughts on the draft at that point.
Okay. Mike?
God, I forgot what I was going to say again.
Well, if it comes to you in the next couple of minutes, let us know. Otherwise, we may be getting ready.
I won't be hesitant.
Anybody else have any other comments, questions, staff, board members?
I'll just throw in too, if you all think of anything or see an example or have ideas, feel free to shoot us emails. I mean, that goes for the public too. I think this process is always open to ideas and suggestions. So, we are going to be working, I say we, meaning Ton, mostly is going to be working pretty hard in the next couple of weeks to pull this information together, but we'll, certainly if you have thoughts along the way, that will be helpful.
Frank, I remembered what I wanted to say. And Leslie, is it possible that we could get feedback from the county commissioner meetings as to regards the short-term rental applications that we turned down?
We've had that request a couple of times, and yes, we are planning to provide a summary at the next meeting, actually. Don's been working on that, and we'll bring that information to your meeting on the 20th. So thanks for the reminder.
Thank you.
You bet.
All right, if there's nothing else, I suggest we adjourn this meeting.
I think we're
Thank
done.
you.
Thanks,
All right.
everyone.
Thank you all
Bye.
very much.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks.
Have a good night.
Yeah, Rex, we'll have to compare ages.